I can still remember that night, as if the memory is scorched into my mind. A night that changed everything. The road was dark, nearly empty, and James, my husband, was quiet beside me, his hands steady on the wheel. We were driving home after a long night out, and I remember thinking how grateful I was for these small, peaceful moments with him. For a moment, I reached out, brushing his hand with mine. He gave a faint smile, but kept his eyes on the road, almost distant, but I brushed it off, thinking he was just tired. Then, suddenly, everything changed in an instant. Blinding headlights flooded my vision. And before I could even comprehend what was happening, there was a horrific, ear-splitting crash. The car lurched, and I felt my body slam against the seat, the air thick with the sound of screeching metal and shattered glass. My head hit something hard, and for a moment everything blurred, spinning in a dizzying whirl of pain and confusion. And then, silence. A thick, eerie silence, broken only by the faint hum of the engine. I lay there, feeling the weight of the car pressing down on me, trapping me in place. Every breath was agony, sharp and unforgiving, as if my chest were being crushed with each attempt to inhale. Through the haze of pain I tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, barely responding to my commands. Panic bubbled up inside me, raw and overwhelming. "James," I managed, my voice weak, barely a whisper that was swallowed by the wreckage around me. I forced myself to reach out, my fingers trembling as they stretched into the darkness, desperate for any sign that he was there, that he was okay, that he would come to me. But then, as I blinked through the haze, I noticed another figure trapped in the twisted wreckage, just a few feet away. A flash of recognition sent a jolt through me, sharper than the pain in my chest. It was her. James's first love, the woman who had always lingered in the background, like a shadow I could never quite escape. My heart pounded in disbelief. She was here. In that moment, I heard James stir beside me, his groan filling the silence. Relief washed over me. He was alive. He would be here for me. He'd pull me from this nightmare. I struggled to reach him, hoping he'd turn to me, that he'd see I needed him more than ever. But as I watched, he slowly lifted his head, his eyes locking onto her, not me. His face, pale and contorted with worry, was focused entirely on her. He was closer to me, just within reach, yet his gaze never wavered. Instead, his hand stretched out, inching toward her. "James," I whispered, my voice catching as the realization dawned on me, sharp and brutal. My heart sank, a hollow, aching feeling spreading through me. I lay there, broken, reaching out to him, yet he didn't even glance my way. His attention, his focus, his care, it was all on her, and in that instant I understood. Even in this moment, even with my life hanging by a thread, he had chosen her. The darkness crept in, my vision blurring as my strength waned. I was fading, my body weak, but the pain in my heart was stronger than anything physical. I was there, lying in the wreckage, my husband just inches away, and yet, I had never felt so alone. As I slipped into unconsciousness, the last thing I saw was his hand, reaching out for her, leaving me to disappear into the dark, cold night. I drifted back to consciousness slowly, as if emerging from a dark, endless tunnel. My body felt heavy, each limb like lead, and every small movement brought a fresh wave of pain. Blinding, sterile lights glared down at me, and the muffled sounds of beeping machines filled the silence. I blinked, trying to focus, trying to make sense of where I was. The memories of the crash came flooding back in painful, fragmented images, the blinding headlights, the sound of shattering glass, the twisted metal, and James. The sharpest memory of all, clear as day, was of James reaching out, not for me, but for her. His choice, his face turned away from me when I needed him most, stayed burned into my mind. I struggled to move, to speak, but my throat was dry, my voice barely more than a hoarse whisper. A nurse appeared by my bedside, her face calm, yet she wore an expression of distant sympathy. She adjusted my IV, checking the machines, her eyes avoiding mine, as though she sensed the storm of emotions brewing within me. Is there someone here for me?" I asked, each word scraping against my throat, as raw and painful as the realization settling over me. The nurse hesitated, her hand pausing on the IV drip. She glanced away, a shadow crossing her face before she finally spoke. "Your husband was here. He stepped out for a while." Her tone was neutral, professional, but I could sense the unspoken truth lingering behind her words. A hollow ache settled in my chest, sharper than any physical pain. He had been here only briefly before leaving again. I wanted to ask why he'd left, where he was, but the words stuck in my throat, the questions too heavy, too suffocating to voice. He had chosen her in the wreckage, and now, in the sterile confines of this hospital room, he had left me again. The days slipped by in a blur of sterile lights and hushed voices. Nurses came and went, adjusting machines, administering medication, but each time I asked about James, the answer was the same: he'll be back soon. But soon stretched on indefinitely, and my room remained silent, empty of the person I needed most. When he finally did come, his visits were brief, almost rushed. He stood by my bedside, barely meeting my gaze, his attention flitting around the room as though he were counting down the minutes. I watched him, feeling the gulf between us grow wider with each passing second, each unanswered question that hung in the air. One day, as he turned to leave, I could no longer bear the silence, the empty space between us that once held so much love. I summoned every ounce of strength, my voice steady, yet laced with the hurt I had carried alone. "James," I called softly. He stopped, his back to me, the tension in his shoulders unmistakable. Slowly he turned to face me, but there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. "That night, why did you choose her?" My words hung heavy in the air, and I could see the impact of them in the way his jaw tightened, his gaze flickering away. He shifted uncomfortably, his hands in his pockets as he looked anywhere but at me. I didn't think you'd make it," he mumbled, his voice low, as if the admission was too much for him to bear. "I had to make a choice, and she was right there." The words cut through me like shards of glass, each syllable a painful reminder of the decision he had made. I stared at him, feeling the weight of his words settle in, each one solidifying the betrayal I had felt since the moment he left me lying in the wreckage. "Right. She was right there," I whispered, echoing his words, though they tasted bitter on my tongue. For a moment, he looked as if he expected something, an understanding nod perhaps, or maybe forgiveness. But all I could feel was the raw, gnawing ache of abandonment, of being left behind by the one person I had trusted most. Without another word, he muttered a quick goodbye and walked away, the door closing softly behind him, sealing me in silence once again. And in that silence, as the cold reality set in, I realized that I was truly, utterly alone. Days bled into each other, a continuous blur of pain, silence, and isolation. The hospital room, with its pale walls and sterile lights, became my world. A world where time felt frozen, and every second felt like an eternity. I tried to distract myself, to focus on the little things, the beeping of the machines, the footsteps echoing down the hallway, the sound of voices in the distance. Anything to avoid facing the truth that lingered, heavy and unyielding. But no matter what I did, the memory of that night, of James's face as he chose her, refused to fade. The nurses and doctors were kind, offering gentle words and comforting smiles, but none of it reached me. They couldn't erase the betrayal carved so deeply into my heart. They didn't see the way James had looked at her, the way he had left me lying there, discarded and forgotten. At night, when the hospital grew quiet and the world outside fell into darkness, the pain would creep in, raw and unrelenting. I'd close my eyes, and the memory would play out again. Vivid and merciless. His hand reaching for her. His choice clear as day. How had it come to this? The man I had trusted, the man I had loved with everything I had left me to die. In the most crucial moment of our lives, he had turned his back on me, as if I were nothing. And now, even here, he couldn't bear to stay by my side, to look at me, to acknowledge what he had done. I found myself trapped in a cycle of questions that had no answers. Had I ever really known him? Had our years together been a lie, a fragile illusion that shattered the moment things got hard? And if they had, then who was I in the midst of it all? The walls seemed to close in, suffocating, as I replayed every moment, every word he had spoken to me in the past. All the promises, the vows, the assurances of love and loyalty, each one now felt empty, like echoes of a life that wasn't really mine. And yet, beneath all the pain, a strange numbness began to take hold. I was exhausted from the betrayal, from the endless waiting, from the hollow words and empty silences. Slowly, that numbness grew, dulling the edges of the hurt, shielding me from the relentless ache that had become my constant companion. I realized then that I couldn't keep waiting for him. I couldn't keep holding on to the hope that he'd walk through that door and make things right, that he'd look at me with remorse, with love. That hope was a prison, chaining me to a version of him that no longer existed, if it ever had. In the stillness of that room, I made a decision, a small, tentative decision, but a decision nonetheless. I would no longer look to him for comfort, for validation, for love. I would face this alone, for no one else was coming to save me. And as I lay there, staring at the cold, unfeeling ceiling above, I let a part of him go. It wasn't a grand release, not yet, but it was the first step, a small, defiant spark in the darkness. I couldn't change what he had done, couldn't erase the betrayal that had left scars deeper than any physical wound. But I could choose, in that moment, to stop waiting for a love that had turned its back on me. I closed my eyes, letting the silence settle around me, embracing it for what it was, a reminder that I was on my own. And strangely, in that silence, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt since the accident. It wasn't hope, not exactly, but a determination, a quiet resolve to find a way forward, no matter how broken the pieces might be. The first few weeks of recovery were brutal. Every movement sent waves of pain radiating through my body, each one a reminder of what I'd been through. Nurses came to help me sit up, to turn in bed, to start physical therapy exercises, each task so excruciatingly slow that I felt as though I'd never be whole again. At first, I couldn't even hold a spoon without my hands trembling, each muscle weakened and unfamiliar. There was something humbling, almost degrading, about needing help for every small action, for things that used to be second nature. The thought of independence felt distant, almost unreachable. Yet I forced myself to go through the motions, each small success a quiet victory I kept to myself. James visited once, maybe twice, during that time. I could barely remember the details of his visits, as if my mind had blocked them out to protect me from the pain of seeing him so detached, so distant. He would sit in the chair across from me, his gaze averted, barely engaging. A few words about how I was feeling, how my recovery was going, and then silence. Awkward, stifling silence. It was almost worse than the accident itself, the way he looked at me, as though I were a stranger, a duty he couldn't wait to leave behind. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to make him understand the depth of the hurt he'd left me with. But each time, the words stuck in my throat, weighed down by a mixture of despair and numbness. Then, one afternoon, he didn't show up at all. I waited, my eyes flicking to the door each time a shadow passed by, each time footsteps echoed down the hall. But the hours slipped by, and still, he didn't come. I tried to ignore the hollow ache that grew inside me, the bitter sting of disappointment that settled like a stone in my chest. By evening, I realized he wasn't coming back. Not today, maybe not ever. That night, as I lay in the dim glow of the hospital room, a clarity settled over me, cold and unfeeling. I had been lying to myself, clinging to the hope that he would change, that he would somehow become the man I had once believed he was. But the reality was undeniable. He had chosen to walk away. He had left me to navigate this pain, this recovery, this new version of myself, completely alone. And maybe that was for the best. The more I forced myself to accept it, the more the numbness grew, spreading through me like armor, shielding me from the ache that lingered beneath. I didn't need him, I told myself, my mind grasping onto the thought like a lifeline. I could do this on my own. The following morning, I asked the nurse if I could try walking. She hesitated, looking over her shoulder as if she were unsure, but eventually she gave a small nod. 2 orderlies helped me out of bed, their hands steadying me as I swung my legs over the edge, my muscles protesting at the strain. Every step felt like a battle. My legs shaky, the weight of my own body a challenge I hadn't anticipated. But I took that first step, and then another. Each step felt impossible, yet somehow I pushed through, driven by something stronger than the pain. It wasn't just about walking again. It was about reclaiming something that had been stolen from me. I was tired of feeling weak, tired of feeling like a victim of choices that weren't my own. In those first trembling steps, I found a glimmer of strength, a strength I hadn't known I possessed. And as I stood there, exhausted, clinging to the rail for support, I realized that I wasn't just fighting for my body. I was fighting for myself. For the woman who had been left in the wreckage. For the woman who had been abandoned. for the woman who was determined to stand, even if it meant standing alone. With each passing day, I felt myself getting stronger. The pain was still there, lingering in the background, but it had become something I could tolerate, something I could push through. My body, once a fragile, broken shell, was now reclaiming some of its strength, some of its resilience. Each day, I pushed a little harder, an extra step, a longer walk, a steadier hand. The nurses noticed, and so did the doctors. They began to smile at me with a kind of respect, as if they too could see that I was fighting for something beyond recovery. But it wasn't their approval that kept me going. It was the quiet realization that, for the first time in a long time, I was learning to rely on myself. James had always been there, or so I thought, my partner, my support. I had leaned on him, trusted him, built my life around the belief that he'd be by my side no matter what. But now I saw the truth. He was gone, and I was still here. I was still fighting, still moving forward, step by step, reclaiming pieces of myself I hadn't even known I'd lost. One morning, as I was standing by the window, watching the world outside with a new clarity, the nurse came in to tell me I had a visitor. My heart stilled, a flicker of hope sparking before I could stop it. But as the footsteps approached, I realized it wasn't James. It was my best friend, Claire. Her face was a mixture of relief and sadness as she took in my thin frame, my pale skin, the scars I now wore like badges of survival. She hugged me, holding me tight, as if she could somehow absorb all the hurt, all the betrayal, through sheer will. "I came as soon as I heard," she said softly, pulling back to look me in the eyes. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I swallowed, feeling a familiar knot form in my throat. "I didn't know how," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "Everything just fell apart." She nodded, her eyes filling with a sympathy that didn't feel like pity but understanding. "Well, I'm here now," she said, her tone firm, her grip on my hand solid and reassuring. "And I'm not going anywhere." We sat together, talking about everything and nothing, and for the first time since the accident, I felt a warmth that had been absent for so long. Claire didn't ask about James, and for that I was grateful. I wasn't ready to talk about him, about the wounds that were still so fresh, so raw. But as we talked, I found myself laughing, a genuine unforced laugh that surprised even me. It was as though, for a moment, the weight of everything lifted, and I could see glimpses of a life beyond this hospital room, beyond the pain that had consumed me. When Claire finally left, promising to visit again soon, I sat in the quiet, letting the peace settle over me. I realized then that I had been holding on to the past, clutching it like a lifeline, afraid to let go because it was all I'd ever known. But maybe there was something waiting for me beyond that pain. A life where I didn't have to measure my worth by someone else's presence or absence. It wasn't about forgetting James or pretending the hurt didn't exist. It was about learning to stand on my own, to trust in myself, to find a strength that was rooted not in what I had lost, but in what I was capable of becoming. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I felt a new sense of purpose growing within me. I didn't have all the answers, and the path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of facing it alone. I was ready to start building a future, one that didn't rely on anyone but myself. And that realization, that spark of independence, felt like the first step toward a freedom I had never known. The day I was discharged felt surreal, like stepping out of one world and into another. I'd spent so long in that hospital room, the days blending together in a blur of pain and isolation that the outside world felt almost foreign. The air was crisp, the sounds sharper, each step out of the hospital's front doors a reminder of how far I'd come. Claire was there, waiting by the entrance, her car idling by the curb. She gave me a warm smile, rushing over to help as I took my first steps into freedom. I tried to wave her off, insisting I could manage on my own, but she wouldn't hear it. She wrapped an arm around my shoulders, steadying me as we made our way to her car. "Just humor me," she said, laughing softly as she helped me into the passenger seat. "You've been through enough." We drove in comfortable silence, the city unfolding around us, each street and building familiar yet strange, like seeing them for the first time. I realized as I watched the world pass by that this was a new beginning, a chance to rebuild, to redefine who I was, not as someone's wife or patient, but as myself. When we arrived at my apartment, Claire helped me inside, her presence a steady comfort as I took in the familiar surroundings. It felt strange to be home again, alone with my thoughts, the silence now thick with memories and shadows of what I'd once believed.
After Claire left, I wandered through the rooms, each one filled with remnants of the life I had shared with James. Photographs on the walls, small trinkets on shelves, clothes that still smelled faintly of him, all reminders of a love that I now realized had been as fragile as glass. For a moment, the familiar ache surfaced, the hollow emptiness that had followed me since the night of the accident. I thought of the years we'd spent together, the promises we'd made, the dreams we'd woven together. All of it now felt like a distant memory, a chapter of my life that had ended the moment he'd turned his back on me. But as I stood there, in the quiet stillness of my own home, a new thought took root. I didn't have to live in the shadows of those memories. Didn't have to carry the weight of betrayal forever. This was my space, my life, and I could choose to fill it with something new, something that belonged to me alone. The first thing I did was gather up every reminder of him, the photos, the gifts, the letters we'd exchanged over the years. I piled them into a box, one by one, each item a small piece of the life I was leaving behind. It hurt, a dull ache spreading through my chest as I closed the lid on that box, but it also felt liberating, like shedding a layer of skin that no longer fit. With a deep breath, I took the box down to the storage room, locking it away, out of sight, out of reach. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about creating space for something new, something that didn't carry the weight of broken promises and empty vows. Over the next few days, I threw myself into the small, simple routines of everyday life. I woke up early, went for short walks, slowly regaining my strength with each step. I'd sit by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the world go by, savoring the quiet moments of solitude that now felt like precious gifts. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city, I realized that I hadn't thought about James in hours. The realization hit me softly, like a whisper, but it filled me with a quiet pride. I was healing, bit by bit, each day carving out a life that was mine alone. There were still hard days, moments when the past would creep in, lingering like a shadow I couldn't quite shake. But each time, I reminded myself that I was moving forward, step by step, building a future that didn't depend on anyone else. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, that future felt like something worth fighting for. In the weeks that followed, I settled into a rhythm, each day feeling a little lighter than the one before. I started filling my home with new things, flowers on the windowsill, books that had gathered dust for years, little pieces of art I'd always wanted but never bought. Each item felt like a quiet declaration that this was my space, my life, built by me and for me. Claire stayed close, her friendship a constant source of warmth, grounding me when I felt lost and cheering me on through each step of my journey. She'd drag me out for coffee, encourage me to join her at art classes, or even sign me up for cooking workshops, filling my days with laughter and moments that reminded me of the simple joys of being alive. One afternoon, while sorting through a stack of old magazines, I came across a flyer advertising a community volunteer program. Something about it caught my eye, and before I knew it, I was signing up, driven by a strange urge to do something outside of myself, something that reminded me of the world beyond my own struggles. The first time I volunteered at the center, a little girl with wide, curious eyes and a shy smile tugged at my sleeve. "Will you play with me?" she asked, her small voice filled with a vulnerability that reminded me of myself in ways I hadn't expected. I knelt down beside her, smiling as I reached out to take her hand. "Of course," I replied, feeling a warmth spread through me, a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. As we played together, her laughter filling the room, I felt something shift. A piece of myself, once broken, slowly beginning to heal. Over time, volunteering became a regular part of my life. Each day at the center, surrounded by people who had their own struggles, their own stories of survival, I found myself growing stronger, my heart opening to the possibility of connection and joy. It wasn't just about moving on from the past. It was about rebuilding myself, discovering who I was, beyond the pain and betrayal that had once defined me. One evening, as I stood on my balcony, watching the city lights flicker against the night sky, a quiet realization settled over me. I was free from the weight of old wounds, from the expectations and disappointments that had once held me back. I had built a life that was mine, filled with people who cared, with moments of peace and purpose, and for the first time, I wasn't looking back. James was part of my story, a chapter that had shaped me in ways I could never erase. But he no longer held power over me. The hurt he had left behind was still there, but it had become a scar, a reminder of the strength I had found in myself, the resilience that had carried me through. As I closed my eyes, breathing in the cool night air, I allowed myself a smile, a genuine, unguarded smile. I didn't know what the future held, and for the first time, that uncertainty didn't scare me. I was ready for whatever came next, ready to face it with the strength I had earned, step by step. Because I had learned that even after the deepest wounds, after the hardest battles, there was always a way forward. And I had found mine. Sarah's journey teaches us that even in the darkest moments, when betrayal and pain seem insurmountable, we can find strength within ourselves. It's a reminder that self-worth doesn't come from others. It's something we build through resilience, independence, and the courage to let go of what no longer serves us. Life may leave scars, but they can be symbols of survival, growth, and the path toward a brighter future. If you've ever been through a challenging time, or if Sarah's story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about courage and self-discovery. Drop a comment about your own journey of resilience or how you found strength in tough times. Let's inspire and support each other, because everyone deserves a story where they find their own strength and happiness.